You know what the most dangerous thing in America is, right? Nigga with a library card.
This is the Most Dangerous Thing in America podcast, a show in which we read books by black authors, and they're talked about by a black author, and you can listen if you are black or not black. That is okay. This week on the podcast, we are discussing the first four acts of Donovan X Ramsey's When Crack Was King. And yeah, next week we'll discuss the second half. This is going to be a long and I believe somewhat strange podcast because of my overall opinion of this book, which is not negative. So I'll just get it out of the way here. It's kind of perfect. Like, I don't really have critiques. I just like everything in it. No book is actually perfect, right? But what I just mean here is really enjoying the book so far. And it's kind of a hybrid. Now, our last book by Hanif Abdurraqib, There's Always Next Year, was also like a hybrid collage thing. This is a hybrid in a different way, a little more straightforward. What you essentially get is journalistic work that gives historical context for the crack era, and then 4 personal stories of people who lived through it. So I guess it's all journalism, right? But some of it is historical and completely objective. And then the other part of it is not subjective, but certainly personal histories. So some of it's going to be left to memory. And I think Donovan X Ramsey does a great job of blending both. So that's basically the structure of the book. And then the other structure piece would be there are 8 acts and an introduction. Now, I guess I didn't say that the book was about crack. I think if you don't know that the title of this book tells you that it's about crack, that's one of those reading comprehension things. But yeah, the book is about the crack era in America. So stretching from the late 70s to the late 90s. Late 70s also kind of a stretch. But the thing about it is that that's when freebase starts. And then into the late 90s, the ripple effects of crack are still felt today. But whether or not crack was still a popular drug by the late 90s is really the question. We're certainly now in the meth/opioid era. But okay. So what we're going to do is just run down the acts. And yeah, usually I have more like insight here, but this is going to be a lot of praise, a lot of me just praising things and saying like, oh, I thought that was interesting. So let's hop in. First part is the introduction. It's pretty straightforward, more or less lays out the groundwork that we've just brought up right now. And the weird part, to talk about Hanif Abdurraqib's book again, is that Donovan X Ramsey, also from Columbus. So we're doing apparently an all Ohio summer. I won't even check where the other 2 are from. I'll just assume that they're from Ohio. I actually think that Chris Herring he went to Michigan. So it's extremely unlikely he's from Ohio. I think he actually might be from Illinois. Okay, so anyway, that's the introduction. And then we get into Act 1. This is the origins. Now, the only thing in Act 1 really is that we just meet the personal histories characters. It's Elgin, it's Lenny, it's Kurt, and Sean. And we meet them after the fact. So here we see how Ramsey has met them in the present day and then why he took them on as subjects. Of these 4, Lenny and Sean are the most interesting. Kurt is the former mayor of Baltimore. Sean is a basketball player from Newark. Lenny is a black woman from South Central LA, and Elgin is from, I believe, Long Island. So Elgin gets the least amount of time in the book. Kurt Schmoke is the mayor of Baltimore. He's interesting, but the 2 most fascinating characters are Lenny and Sean. Lenny in particular is the most tragic character so far in the first half of the book, and Sean is like the one you're really rooting for. You know Kurt is going to make it because you know his history. And then Elgin, he has like one chapter, or I mean, he has this chapter and maybe one more, but he's essentially a non-issue. So yeah, that's Act 1. And then we get into Act 2, which is subtitled Incubation. And this is where we get the first objective history, journalistic history, whatever you want to call it. And these are great. He does a really great job of covering a lot of time. So here he starts with the Great Migrations and Black people. Well, obviously, if you don't know what the Great Migration is, that is when Black people left the South. There were more than one, but when Black people left the South and settled in northern cities and western places. And yeah, the first Great Migration is mostly Black people going to Detroit, Chicago, and then like Baltimore and a few other cities. And then the second Great Migration is more westward, I believe, Los Angeles, and still probably more into those cities that we've already named. You can actually map, I saw somebody do this online, the regions of where people are from in the South and where they went. So a lot of people from Louisiana and Texas went to California, or people from Louisiana just went to Texas one state over. But yeah, so he covers that, and then he goes into the long, hot summer. And this is where we get like the Watts riots and general unrest. And what's happening is the inner city is exploding because it's been neglected for years, and economic opportunities are starting to leave the area. And the politicians are starting to take notice. So on page 37, we get the Kerner Report, which was a report commissioned by Lyndon B. Johnson, and Otto Kerner Jr. was the governor of Illinois and the commission chair. Here's what Kerner had to say. What white Americans have never fully understood. So the Kerner Report was supposed to look into like, what's up with all this unrest? Why are people rioting? What's going on? So that's why Lyndon B. Johnson was like, hey, figure this out because we can't have this. This is after the National Guard and the army had been called in to quell riots in Detroit, the Detroit 12th Street riot, things like that. Horrible, horrible things that happened throughout the country. So then the Kerner Report's released after it was commissioned. And this is straight from the Kerner Report. He says, what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. This is a very interesting thing that this through line here that happens here, and we pick it back up. Let me see exactly where. When we first talk about Sean later in this chapter, and it's the idea of the housing projects in the ghetto. I'll get back to it when we pick up Sean, but this is the first instance. Directly after this, Martin Luther King said that the Kerner Report was a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. Beautiful. Okay, and then we get taken from there. As I said, Ramsey does a great job of moving through. So just in a few pages, we get up to Spiro Agnew, and he is having, so Spiro Agnew with Nixon, new White House, right? So we've moved. But the problems persist. There was just a riot in Baltimore, and Spiro Agnew more or less calls in a bunch of black leaders to tell them that black people are just violent, right? He says, now parts of many of our cities lie in ruins. You need not leave these city limits to verify the destruction and the resulting hardships to our citizens. And you know whom the fires burned out, just as you know who lit the fires. They were not lit in honor of your great fallen leader, talking about MLK, nor were they lit from an overwhelming sense of frustration and despair. Those fires were kindled at the suggestion and with the instruction of the advocates of violence. Naturally, black people weren't angry. They just like being violent. So there you go. And then on page 43, we start to get to the idea of like, we need to have a war on this stuff. And this is also going to be a recurring thing that Ramsey talks about. There's an epidemic how are we going to solve it, right? And the obviously the way that they decided to solve it was by declaring war on it and throwing everybody in jail. But here are some things from a few people who were in the White House. So here's H.R. Haldeman. He said, "You have to face the fact," he's quoting somebody here, but whatever. "You have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to." And then Ehrlichman, who was counsel and assistant to Nixon, said, "The Nixon campaign in '68 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people." So there you go. What's interesting about this in particular is that eventually there's going to be declared a war on, narcotics, and later, not later, but at the same time, things like numbers, rackets, and stuff like that. And you look at modern America, and there's another epidemic, which is opioids. And we're seeing the beginnings of a gambling epidemic with things like FanDuel and Prize Picks and all these different gambling apps and websites that you can use anywhere that are, available to people who are 18 years old. And it's the same old thing that everybody always says. It's the same old book. But once you can legalize it and monetize it, then it's okay. Opioids are fine if they're murdering people, as long as the person who makes the decision is wearing a suit and comes from money. But the other drugs are not. Of course, in reality, we want all people to get help who are addicts. So it's not saying that the people who sold crack were faultless, but the people who are selling opioids aren't either. So there's just that contrast. And then FanDuel, I don't know if I want the FanDuel people thrown in jail, but I think we do need more education around what gambling can do, right? Anyway, so just an interesting thing that's often brought up, right? Not an original thought, but once you legalize these things and can monetize them, not even legalize them, once the person who is doing these things is viewed as legitimate and does it through legal routes, and you can monetize it, then you're good. Okay, so that's the first part of Act II, just like giving us that historical context. And then we get into the early years of some of our characters. So just focusing on the two really that I really like. Lenny in South LA. Now, when I say I really like Lenny, it's just that the story's fascinating. Like everything she goes through, early alcoholism and everything like that, the abuse from her guardians. It's amazing that she survived. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by being fascinating. By liking, I just, you can't read it and not help but pull for her. It's great to know that she made it. So, right, because he's interviewing her for the book, so that you can at least read it with a little sense of calm in a way. But anyway, she's in South LA where 1 out of 10 adults were unemployed and 25% live below the poverty line. So that's where she is. Sean is in Newark in New Jersey. He's in the projects. And now to get back to this, it strikes me how the projects are an urban planning disaster. And, that's earlier we were talking about how white people were complicit in creating the ghetto. And so what my basic question here when I was thinking about the projects was, you have these high-rise buildings. In the middle, there's a playground and a courtyard. There's a community. Like, why didn't it work? And then I looked up just briefly one article and then a couple of books that I need to read I haven't read. But the gist of it seems to be that, number one, these were created as part of the Works project that FDR spearheaded when he was president. And the idea was to get rid of homelessness as much as possible and take care of our poor citizens, but there were stipulations placed on these housing projects so that they couldn't compete with commercial real estate. That is, they didn't want the government coming in and building housing projects that were good enough to lure away the middle and upper class. So that's number one. And then is by extension of that, they were then built shoddily, right? They were also built by the federal government, but were supposed to be maintained by the state government. That's a problem because the state government didn't have funds for them. So worse buildings that are going to be poorly maintained. That's bad. Then the buildings had restrictions on them about who could, about income caps. So now you have no diversity of people inside of the buildings. It's just all low-income people. And then we already talked about the lack of economic opportunities. So you take all three of those things and add to it the fact that, okay, you're low income, but now also there's no economic opportunity in the neighborhoods where these things are being built. Put all four of those together, and I'm sure more, and it's going to be pretty bad. Now, I haven't read all of the books. All I read was one article, and then I skimmed a book that's about the housing project in Chicago. But it strikes me that that makes sense because on its face, it's a good idea, right? Like the projects should be a good idea. It sounds weird to say the projects. Public housing created and maintained by the government should be a good idea, but it's not. And the biggest reason seems to be, and I want to dig into it more, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the biggest reason is the need to profit. The fact that you couldn't build, like the first reason I said, the fact that you couldn't build the houses to compete with commercial properties seems to me to be the biggest reason. And maybe that's why in subsequent years they've done those things where you can build large buildings like the ones that are next to the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, but you have to have a certain number of apartments which are reserved for people with low income. And so that way you're not recreating the projects, you're just creating a diverse amount of people inside of a building. So maybe we've improved upon it. I haven't read enough. I am interested. But it did make me think of it, just even the way that Ramsey describes the Hayes homes. That's where Sean lives. And also I had recently read a Thelonious Monk autobiography, and he also lived in public housing, went from one project to another, but he definitely prized when he was there the community. So I just thought it was interesting. That being said, there were multiple fires that occurred in the Monk household, and I don't believe they ever, I can't remember right now, but I don't believe they ever found the culprit. So perhaps it was from the buildings being shoddily made. Certainly one of the buildings he lived in was shoddily made. But the point is, in theory, you would think the housing would work, plus you're around your community. It's good. So another research area to look into. And then he also talks about Kurt Schmoke. Probably the most interesting part of that chapter is the Janet Cook episode. Janet Cook won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on a ridiculous story about a child crack addict that turned out to be fabricated. And she said in her own words, she wanted to create a super N-word. And the reason I'm not saying the word is because she dropped the hard R. So we don't go in for the hard R on this podcast. At least not today. Maybe I have before. I can't remember. But it just seems too much to do. But yeah, so that's Act 2. And it's a really, probably like my favorite section of the book in a way. I took a lot of notes. It's hard to say which is my favorite. I love this section. I took a lot of notes. Act 3 and 4, I was just so into it, I guess, and the reading was so breezy that I didn't take as many notes. But I think part of it is because in Act 3, we kind of get more backstory. So Act 3 is called Outbreak, obviously referring to the idea that crack is starting to happen, hasn't quite happened yet. We're in the 70s. So he starts this Act 3 by giving us historical context for cocaine. He goes all the way back to the Incas. And he talks about how the Spanish gave the Incas the drug so they would work harder. Like they noticed, oh yeah, these guys work really hard when we give them, or when they chew cocoa leaves, so they get more energy. And they're like, let's give them even more. And then he talks about how it was used from everything from fatigue to flatulence. That's in like the 19th century. Also morphine addiction, but I just thought flatulence was weird. And then he goes on to talk about Coca-Cola. Everybody knows that one, right? That's the famous one. And then into where did we actually get crack from? And Ramsey goes on to explain the fact that cocaine was a high-class drug. So here's a article in Newsweek. Among hostesses in the smart sets of Los Angeles and New York, a little cocaine like Dom Perignon and Beluga caviar is now de rigueur at dinners. Some party givers pass it along with the canapes on silver trays. It's just funny that it's in Newsweek, I think. But he also talks later about how freebase, like because it was coming from cocaine, was also like was classy. So that's interesting too, because I'd always assumed that freebase, which is like before we get to crack, was like the unstable version of crack, is freebase. I didn't realize that it was classy, but it was. And then from there, we get a little book called The Pleasures of Cocaine. And this was published by Adam Gottlieb, which was a pseudonym of a drug enthusiast named John Mann. And this had a recipe for making freebase with baking soda. And Ramsey points out here and then later that Rick Ross often gets credited with creating crack, like coming up with the recipe. But it was actually probably these like Bay Area hippies who were experimenting and then figured it out. And then, it's in The Pleasures of Cocaine. So there you go. Okay. So that's mostly Act 3's intro. And then we get more character development. We basically just get like Sean dealing with adolescence and trying to figure out how he can play basketball and watching his community change. That's what we get from Sean. From Lenny, we get the worst. She's having the worst life. Like she started to drink at like 11 years old. Her uncle is molesting her. She accidentally slips into prostitution, like doesn't even know she's doing that in Culver City. And yeah, things just are, she's like 13 and living a life that no adult would envy. So just a crazy, crazy life. Not a life for a kid, not a life for an adult, as I said. So yeah, that's Act 3. And it's great, really fascinating. Then we get into Act 4. And now Act 4 is heavier on the historical context. So where Act 3 really focused up on Lenny and Sean, Act 4 is going to take us into crack. So Act 4 is called Ready Rock, which was the original name of crack. And so in Act 4 we get Rick Ross, probably, on the short list of most famous drug dealers of all time. So we don't really need to, there's Pablo Escobar, there's Rick Ross, there's modern guys. But yeah, we get Rick Ross, who was trying to play tennis apparently, and it didn't work out, and then gets into drugs, selling them. And then so we get all of his backstory and how he comes to, get into making Ready Rock. We get the war on drugs and the shifting views of crack cocaine. When people start to realize like, oh, this isn't like so there's cocaine. Okay, that's pretty glamorous. Freebase. Yeah, still glamorous, but dangerous. And then we get crack cocaine and it starts to decimate places. And probably the most telling statistic is how high the overdose rate got. Now this is before crack actually. So the views on crack cocaine are changing, but crack cocaine still doesn't quite exist yet. It's still freebase. But the overdose, but it's veering towards freebase, right? So the overdoses are on the rise by these percentages in these cities. New York, 36. Boston, 46. New Orleans, 53. Miami, 72. Philly, 83. LA, 90. Just a huge increase in overdoses. Now, to put that in perspective, I looked at the recent overdoses in America. This is over a 3-year span from 2017 to 2020, and it's up. So in suburban areas, it's up like, according to the Pew Research Center, 5%. In urban areas, 9%. And in rural areas, 6%. So that's, whatever, up altogether, 6% or so. Whereas in the 80s, it's jumping up. The lowest one there was 36% in New York. So that just shows not that we're not in a serious situation now, but the kind of situation we were in the 1980s is absolutely insane. So that's setting the stage for it. And then we actually get crack, right? Then Ready Rock gets full on into crack. And we end this part of the objective reality with Lynn Bias, which is the flashpoint for a lot of people who were alive at the time. I was born in the 80s, so I do not remember this because I wasn't old enough. But anybody who was in college or high school would remember it. I was old enough to remember Magic Johnson getting AIDS or Michael Jordan retiring, but I was just a little bit too young to remember Lynn Bias. But anyway, we kind of end our section with that because it really shows that crack had now become scary, like full on scary. If it wasn't enough to see people at crack houses and read exposés and Spin magazine, seeing Lynn Bias, who was a apex athlete, that really drove it home to people that oh, this thing is dangerous. So, yeah, that's where we end the objective part of this section. And then we further Lenny and Sean's story a little. They progress a little bit more. Lenny's story is basically that she finds crack at this time, as well as keeping up those other behaviors. And Sean manages to get into college. It's a community college, but still it's college. And he's hooping. He's playing well. And he goes back on summer vacation and he sees the whole projects is just changed. But he's still walking the straight and narrow more or less. Which is cool, so you're rooting for him. But we kind of know that it doesn't end that way because we're told in the first section. So that sucks. But yeah, so that's the first 4 sections of the book. So a bit shorter than I thought talking about it. Like I said, I don't have critiques here. I'm just fascinated by everything I'm reading. Ramsey does a great job with the historical context, number 1. And then number 2, you're really locked in on Lenny and Sean. They're real people, but they almost feel like characters in a book, which they are, fictitious characters. Especially Lenny's story is so crazy that it's hard to imagine. It's hard to wrap your mind around what she went through. Sean's story a little bit more accessible. I mean, if a lot of people know someone who tried to hoop to get their way out of the projects. That wasn't. I mean, the projects were bad when he was growing up in them, but they weren't like what they became. So, at any rate, that one's a little bit more relatable, or I don't, you may have met a person like Sean. The Lenny story is just shocking. Yeah, and when you read a story like Lenny's story, it makes that Janet Cook controversy look even funnier or just crazier, weirder, whatever, because there were real stories out there. Had she done the real reporting, she could have found something that was every bit as tragic. Maybe she would have had to wait a year or two, something like that. But yeah, the article that broke everything in Spin didn't have to make anything up, So the name of that article, which was published in 1986 by Barry Michael Cooper, I actually don't have the name, but he really broke. It may have been like New Jack City or something, he wrote New Jack City, so it might have had that in the title because he used to write journalism. But he was able to write a real account that showed just how horrible crack was. So anyway, those are the first 4 acts. I loved them. My only question, concern, or criticism, my only eyebrow raise in this entire book so far is on page 21 when we first meet Lenny. Her last name is Woodley, and this is in the present day. He says, Miss Woodley is Los Angeles through and through. She refers to the area in South Central where she grew up as the Hood. Okay. She calls her friends the homies. All right. I will admit right now that I just assumed everybody said the Hood and the homies. Is that a California thing? Is that LA specific? I guess. She has the black Angelino accent too, a unique blend of linguistic influences that transforms words like party into porty and folk into folk. Now, party into porty, I don't think so. Poor die, he says. Porty. I don't think I've heard that. The folk into folk, definitely not. I remember us playing with a dude from Pensacola on our college basketball team, and I remember it. The way he said folk was so different, and the fact that nobody even said that word. So maybe it's a generational thing, because I don't think anybody growing up in like the 80s or 90s would use the word folk unless they were Southern. And Lenny's people, or maybe still had some of that Southern stuff rubbing off on them. So maybe it's that. But at any rate, extremely minor concern. I am excited to read the next 4 acts, which we're going to do in 2 weeks. So this is coming out today, July 12th. And in 2 weeks, July 26th, we'll have the next 4 acts out. I don't anticipate any issues. This thing is, like I said, it's reading like a memoir, I guess is the best way to put it. A personal history memoir with some also actual journalistic history sprinkled on top. And for my generation, I think this is like a very familiar. All the stuff Ramsey's saying is very familiar. He's hitting all the beats, you know. He's hit from Nixon. He's hit from the long hot summer, unrest in black cities, riots, economic blight, lack of economic opportunity, and then drugs being funneled into the inner city, Rick Ross, Reagan, Dare, war on drugs. He's hitting all the beats. And then on top of it, we're getting personal history. So masterful job so far. I look forward to the next 4 acts. All right. That's going to do it for today. As we already said, July 26th, we'll have the next 4. After that, Smoke Kings. So if you want to, get that book. And Blood in the Garden in August. In the meantime, if you would subscribe, that'd be great. Tell a friend, even better. Tweet, share this somewhere. That would be cool. And the music that you're listening to is by TheKeepRunning. Link in the show notes. If you want to check out anything I've written, there's a link in the show notes. And I think that's it. Until next time, stay safe, stay black, and keep reading.
This time enough at last. That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now. There was all the time I needed. That's not fair. That's not fair.